Hi class, welcome to lecture 6, part A. Today we're going to be talking all about nominations and the election process, essentially how politicians run for office. So let's go ahead and start by defining elections, which I'm pretty sure we all know what they are, but let's get the definition in there so we can have some context for what we're talking about. We're going to define elections as the principal way by which the American people influence and control what their government does, right? So we vote for people to make laws for us to lead us. And theoretically, at least, they are doing these things. They're enacting these laws. They are taking policy, enacting policy on behalf of the people. And, in political science, in most social sciences, definitions are somewhat fluid. We've talked about this before, and the same goes for democracy, right? You might have 10, 20, 30 different definitions of what a democracy actually is, but any definition worth its salt will have free and fair elections, okay? Meaning that people can vote, it's non-tampered with, and it's not fixed. In some countries that are less democratic, they have elections, but they're oftentimes fixed or cheated, right? To give an example of that, before the US invaded Iraq and overthrew Saddam Hussein, they had an election in which he won with something like 95% of the vote, right? Which is pretty ridiculous. So, some countries will lie and cheat to make their government seem more legitimate. But free and fair elections are a very crucial element of any democracy. So a key term that I'm going to use in this lecture that you need to know is suffrage and or franchise. They both mean the same thing. You should know this. I'll test you on this. Simply means the legal right to vote. So when you hear women's suffrage, that's a common term. It means women gain the right to vote, right? Don't confuse it with suffering. I remember there was a skit, I think it was on Jimmy Kimmel, where they went on the street and they asked people, do you support women's suffrage? And people didn't know what suffrage meant, and they thought it meant suffering. So they thought he was asking, do you support women's suffering? So some people said no, essentially saying they don't support the right of women to vote, which is of course terrible, but that was kind of the joke. So suffrage, franchise simply mean the legal right to vote. So another important aspect you guys need to know about federal elections, and this slide is very wordy, but what you need to know is that even though we have federal elections, they are run at the state level, and there are also state elections and local elections as well. So let's go to the next one. And because even for federal elections, presidential elections, congressional elections, because they're held at the state level and monitored at the state level, you might get different voting rules from state to state, okay? The rules for how you can cast your ballot might be different, whether electronic or not, whether they're punch ballots, which I think they still are in LA, or write-in ballots, or the last day to mail, whatever it is. Those are going to be different from state to state because even though they are federal elections, they are monitored by the state. And we have about 500,000 or so electoral positions in the United States. So if any of you are ever considered running for office, I highly encourage you to do so, even if it's at a local level, your state, if you live in a small town, maybe your city council or whatever, head of sanitation, there's a ton of positions. And if you do, I will give you extra credit, but you have to thank me in your acceptance speech. That's the deal. So in the US, we have fixed election dates, particularly for the presidency is what I wanted to talk about. And we kind of do it a weird way. So national elections are held on the Tuesday after the first Monday in November. So not the first Tuesday in November, the Tuesday after the first Monday in November. We call that Super Tuesday. So why do we do this? It's kind of a weird way to do it. Instead of getting it a date on the calendar, it has to be the Tuesday after the first Monday in November. It's left over from American history where people used to be much more religious. So they didn't want to travel on Sundays because they go to service, mass, or whatever it would be, they could travel Monday and then get there on Tuesday. So that's kind of the thought process behind this. Is that relevant today? No, but at this point it's tradition and we keep doing it. So that's why we have our elections on the Tuesday after the first Monday in November. Kind of a weird American thing we do, but we got a ton of those weird things in this country. Also, things you should know about our election system. It is a winner-take-all system, meaning, and we've talked about this before, but meaning that whoever wins the most votes wins the election, right? You can win 49.9% of the vote. The other person wins 51.1%. They win, you get nothing. It's winner-take-all. And it's first past the post system. Whoever gets the most votes wins. So let's say it's a congressional district for the US House of Representatives. Whoever gets the most votes out of the candidates running wins the election. Everyone else gets nothing. Okay. You need a majority. No, you do not need a majority, I should say, excuse me, for victory, just a plurality. So let's differentiate between majority and plurality. Majority is over 50% or more, or over 50%, let's say. Okay, any one vote over 50% is a majority, whereas a plurality is, as I said before, simply the most votes. So if you won an election with majority, you would have gotten at least one vote over 50%. If you win with a plurality, you could win with 30%, a 35%, 20%, as long as you have the most votes. That's the difference between majority and plurality. So we have the constitutional right to vote in this country in the 15th Amendment, which was ratified in 1870, one of the Civil War amendments. And it reads, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the US or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." Remember, this was a Civil War amendment. It was ratified 5 years after the conclusion of the Civil War. And when they say previous condition of servitude, they're saying former slaves have the right to vote. You can't prevent someone from voting because they used to be a slave, they used to not be a citizen. Okay, so very important amendment we have, the 15th Amendment. Now, it's funny because when you think about the United States, you think of it as the beacon of democracy, you know, one of the oldest democracies still in existence, depending on how you define democracy. But what's interesting is in 1788, the year that the Constitution was ratified, only 23% of the adult population could actually vote. Is that really democratic? I would say no. Less than 1/4 of all American citizens could vote in 1788, again, the year the Constitution was ratified. So let's kind of think about that here. Who couldn't vote in 1788? Well, you know, women couldn't vote, right? That eliminates, you know, about half the population right there. And then you have people of color, slaves also could not vote. So, you know, despite being an old democracy, we were very undemocratic in certain aspects when this country was founded and in our early days. Of course, over time, more and more people have gained the right to vote, suffrage, franchise. And by 1971, over 95% of adults could legally vote. So not everyone can still vote in this country. Who might that be? You know, felons, some ex-felons, depending on the crime and the time period in the state. That'll differ from state to state. So I think an interesting question is, should felons be able to vote? Should people in prison be able to vote? And should former people who's committed a serious crime be able to vote? And it's somewhat controversial, but I'm curious to see what you guys think about that. So when did certain groups gain the right to vote? I think it's important to go over this history. We talked about the 15th Amendment. African Americans gained the right to vote in 1870. But of course, gaining the legal right to vote and the actual right to vote are two different things, right? We know that African Americans were severely disenfranchised in the South for 100 years, almost 100 years, really until the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, when the government decided it was actually going to enforce the 15th Amendment. And they would do all sorts of things to prevent African Americans from voting, many of which we'll talk about in another lecture. Women did not gain the right to vote until 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment. That's not that long ago, guys. That's 101 years ago. That's nothing. That's just a few generations, really. I mean, if you think about it, my grandmother, who's since passed, was born in 1927. Her mother, my great grandmother, was born in, I believe, 1897. So that's just a couple of generations removed. Women were not able to vote. So, it took a long time for women to fight and get that right, that they deserve to vote. Those aged 18 to 20 could not vote until 1971, our 26th Amendment. And remember, there's only 27 total. And that law was changed because of what was going on at this time in 1971. We were in the midst of the Vietnam War. Now, what was going on was you had young men, ages 18, 19, and 20, getting drafted and sent to fight and often die in the jungles of Vietnam, but they couldn't even vote for the politicians who were sending them there. So we realized that wasn't right, or Congress and states realized that wasn't right, so they passed the 26th Amendment. And as I said, those who can't vote today are often incarcerated felons and ex-felons, and those on holds in mental institutions often cannot vote as well. Okay, so let's talk about two different types of elections we have in this country. Starting with presidential elections, pretty obvious is when we elect the president. It's every 4 years. Presidents serve 4-year terms. They can serve up to 2 terms. And what we know when we talk about presidential elections versus midterm elections is that voter turnout tends to be higher in presidential elections. People show up when they're voting for the president. Why is that? Perhaps because they think it's more important, perhaps because it's an individual, you can kind of put a face behind the name. But for whatever reason, we know that compared to midterm elections, presidential election voter turnout tends to be higher. Midterm elections take place in between presidential elections. They are also every 4 years. It's important that you make a note of that. Some people think they're every 2 years, but they're not. They're every 4 years. Because if you think about it, they're staggered. So let's say we had the presidential election in 2020, 2022 we'll have a midterm, 2024 we'll have another presidential, 2026 we'll have another midterm. So there's 4 years in between presidential elections, but there's also 4 years between midterm elections. I'm going to test you on that, so make sure you remember that. And voter turnout, as I said before, tends to be lower in midterm elections than presidential elections. And every 2 years, all House of Representative seats are up for grabs, and Senate seats are staggered because they're every 6 years. So here you can see a chart from Pew Research. In case you can't tell, I like Pew Research. I use a lot of their graphs. It's a little out of date. I couldn't find a more recent one that I liked, but you can kind of see how high the voting turnout is per year, usually averaging around, for presidential, 50 to 70 per, well, now this last year was around 68, 69%, which is very high. Midterm elections are quite a bit lower from this time period, around 40%. So not that high. Now, speaking of midterm elections, continuing on with them, what we know about midterm elections is the incumbent president, that is the sitting president, almost always loses congressional seats. So if history tells us anything, in 2022, when we have our midterm elections, Joe Biden, who's a Democrat, his party, the Democrats, will most likely lose congressional seats. That almost always happens. And since 1862, the sitting president's party has lost about 32 seats in the House and 2 in the Senate. So it's usually a big turnaround. And so rare is it that the sitting president actually gains congressional seat, their party. It's only happened twice in US history, FDR in 34 and George W. Bush in 2002. So why were these two presidents successful in gaining seats, congressional seats in midterm elections? Because they served during times of extreme tragedy or catastrophe, we might say. FDR in 34 in the midst of the Great Depression, right? So people tend to rally around the president in times of these catastrophes. George W. Bush right after 9/11, right? So his approval rating shot up, and he actually gained the Republicans gained congressional seats. So those are the only 2 times in recorded history that that's actually happened. So, expect the Democrats to probably lose seats in 2022 in our next midterm election. So I mentioned this before, but you need to know in Congress how often they hold elections. The House of Representatives, the lower house in Congress, they hold elections every 2 years, which is a lot. I mean, essentially they're always running for re-election because it takes, about a year to prepare for an election. So half their time almost is spent running for re-election. The Senate, however, they have 6-year terms. So they only have to run for election every 6 years, and they're staggered. So not every Senate seat is up for election every 6 years. It's staggered among midterm and presidential elections. Okay, so let's talk about voter turnout. Now, voter turnout in 2020 was very high for the United States at 66.8%. That's extremely high. In fact, it's the highest presidential election turnout in this century. Despite that, the US traditionally, you saw the chart I showed, has pretty low voter turnout compared to other democracies in the world. So let's take a look at this chart. You can see the US, this is average voting turnout. Compared to other democracies like Belgium, Denmark, Brazil, Sweden, Germany, Norway, we're pretty far down there. So I think it's worth asking why. Why is our voter turnout traditionally so abysmal? And again, it is growing. I mean, almost 70% in 2020. 2016 was also very high when Trump beat Clinton. Some of the reasons maybe why we have such low turnout, for one, in the US, we have to actively register. Okay, so in some other countries, when you turn 18, the government automatically registers you to vote. In the US, you have to take that upon yourself. You have to fill out the paperwork and register yourself. So that extra step discourages some people. Maybe we're just a lazy nation. Maybe, people move, they don't have home addresses. It could be a lot of reasons, but that extra step does prevent some people from voting. Also, some of these higher countries at the top here have mandatory voting. So if you don't vote in the election, you get fined. So, it kind of inflates the numbers a little bit. So ask yourself, would you support that? Would you support a system in the United States where they fined you if you didn't vote, like $100 or $200? Something to think about, very interesting. Also, another reason we tend to have low turnout is, as I said before, elections take place on a Tuesday. People work. We don't have it as a national holiday. And, I don't like to give my own opinions in these classes, but I'm going to go ahead and do it here. I think that's absolutely ridiculous that we vote on a Tuesday. I mean, it's supposed, your work in California is supposed to give you time off to vote, but everyone's so busy with work, and sometimes they just ignore this. There is no excuse for it not to be a national holiday. I'm just going to be frank about it. We should have the day off, and all you have to do that day is vote. If we want to see voter turnout rise, I think that's the best way to do it. Again, not to give my personal opinions, but I think it's absolutely ridiculous. Another reason perhaps is oversaturation. We're just inundated with so much information, so many commercials, and so much propaganda, for lack of a better word, shot at us. So I think a lot of us just get kind of sick of it and don't want to deal with it. Okay, so that's going to do it for part A of this lecture. Thank you for tuning in. I will post part B as soon as I can.